In honor of Thatcher Demko's 100th win as a Vancouver Canuck, I'd like to revisit a quote from Brian Burke. "I've never seen a city in the NHL where people love goalies more than they do here. If you look at goalies in the past, if they play well, they are gods. But this might be a goalie graveyard when you start struggling." What was Brian Burke referring to? And how did the Canucks go from goalie graveyard to goalie factory? Let's rewind to the 97-98 season. Captain Kirk's last season with the Canucks. He had given the franchise a solid decade of goaltending, but was towards the end of his career. He was also behind the curve of new age goaltending, as his stand-up style was outdated compared to the more modern butterfly technique. In this season, the Canucks went through 5 goaltenders, of whom Arthurs Irbe was the most effective with a .907 save percentage. However, the team was an absolute tire fire on the ice. They finished dead last in the Western Conference and even fired legendary GM Pat Quinn. In 1998, the Vancouver Canucks appointed Brian Burke as their GM, and a retool began. However, the Canucks were led to the bottom of the standings again by a tandem of Garth Snow and Corey Hirsch. Perhaps the most interesting thing to come out of this season in net was the acquisition of Kevin Weeks, who should have his jersey retired in the Canucks Goalie Graveyard Hall of Fame. Yes, he was young and playing on a poor team, but he put up an 0-8-1 record with an .868 save percentage in the height of the dead puck era. Weeks was eventually shipped out due to a bizarre set of circumstances. In 99-2000, Weeks was backing up Garth Snow, who suffered an injury. The Canucks called up a kid named Alfie Michaud from the minors, but had no plan to put him anywhere near the net. Weeks felt a small tweak in his knee and skated to the bench. Canucks trainer Mike Bernstein met him at the gate and said, "No effing way. Get the F back out there." The Canucks were not going to hang Alfie out to dry. The kid was not even an NHL prospect. He was an emergency backup. The kid was so nervous, he spilled water all over himself trying to take a sip out of a bottle. Eventually, Bernstein allowed Weeks to get checked out and Alfie was lit up. The Canucks lost, but it wasn't his fault. At the end of the game, Weeks went to Bernstein and told him that his knee was miraculously feeling better. Weeks was already not a well-liked player in that locker room, and this event was a straw that broke the camel's back. Mark Messier went to Brian Burke and told him, "Trade him, or I'll effing kill him." Shortly after, Weeks was gone. I'm relaying this story to you the way it was presented in Brian Burke's book, and I have to hand it to Burke. He turned the Canucks' fortunes around. He was excellent at identifying talent and making aggressive moves in order to build a competitive team. He acquired Jovanovski, Klatt, Salo, and Brendan Morrison through trades. However, his pro scouting at the goaltender position left a lot to be desired. The Canucks went through Felix Potvin, Garth Snow, and Bob Senza before finally settling with Dan Cloutier in the 2001-2002 season as their starting goalie. He proceeded to finish 33rd in save percentage amongst goalies with minimum 25 games played. His most famous highlight that season?
Perhaps an odd man rush against the Wings. Now Lindstrom to center right, drives one in, baby! Oh, it skipped past Cloutier in the first chink in the armor of the Vancouver goaltender.
The Canucks were up 2-0 in that series, but to be fair, Detroit was probably going to come back even if Cloutier made that save. However, Cloutier's performance in the 0-3 playoffs was unacceptable. Colorado and Detroit, the Canucks' biggest threats, were both knocked out in the first round. The Canucks were stacked, and their star players were in their prime. Things were looking good in the second round versus Minnesota, as they took a commanding 3-1 series lead. But then, the team collapsed. They lost 7-2, 5-1, and eventually 4-2 in Game 7. Cloutier finished the playoffs with an .868 save percentage. A year later, Cloutier looked sharp against the Flames, but suffered an injury in Game 3. To make matters worse, Johan Hedberg, the backup goalie, also got injured, and third stringer Alex Auld couldn't close it out in Game 7. An injury to both starter and backup, the goalie graveyard was cursed. After the lockout, the Canucks played some incredibly uninspired hockey and missed the playoffs. The team was at a critical point. The West Coast Express was aging, the Sedins were butting into star players, and there was a crop of youngsters like Kessler, Bieksa, and Burroughs itching to make a mark. But how could the team move forward? What could they do to improve the most critical position? A position that had been harming them for over a decade. Well, Nonis picked up the phone and called Mike Keenan, a man who oversaw the worst 2 seasons in Canucks history. He asked him, "Do you want Todd Bertuzzi?" Keenan replied, "I guess Roberto's gotta be involved in that, doesn't he?" The rest, as they say, is history. It was as if Keenan was atoning for all he put the Canucks through in the late 90s, trading Linden, bringing in Messier, but I digress. This trade was a turning point in the history of the Vancouver Canucks. No more goalie graveyard, only goalie heaven from here on out. This trade saw immediate returns, and if it wasn't for our historic season by Martin Brodeur, Luongo would have set the record for most wins in the season and win the Vezina. He finished second in voting for the Vezina and oddly enough second for the Hart Trophy, above Brodeur, who was third. Luongo's tenure as a goaltender in Vancouver was not without its hiccups. Who could forget the 7-goal outburst from the Hawks in 2009 to close out the series? And a repeat loss in 2010. But the Canucks were proactive. Mike Gillis went out and hired Rolly Melanson. This was a surprise to Luongo, but ended up being quite the coup. He helped Luongo reinvent his game, who earned another Vezina nomination in Melanson's first season. Melanson also oversaw the development of Corey Schneider and Eddie Lack. After the fiasco of 2014, the Canucks decided to move in a new direction. They signed Ryan Miller to a 3-year deal. He was often the only bright spot on a bleak, stale, slow, and boring roster. Signing goaltenders in free agency isn't the most sustainable strategy. Just look at the Jack Campbell signing or Jonas Korpisalo. The best goaltenders, the Shesterkins, Ottingers, Sorokins, Vasilevskis of the world, are developed in-house. And the Canucks have had an excellent setup for years, a setup that has produced results. When it was time for Miller to leave, the Canucks had Jacob Markstrom ready to replace him. As you all know, Markstrom came over in the Luongo deal as a highly touted prospect who just could not figure it out. His debut as a Canuck was a nightmare. He was pulled after letting in 3 goals on 4 shots. Fans were wondering what the Canucks saw in him. Rolly Melanson believed in him, and Markstrom was sent to Utica, where he worked with Dan Cloutier out of all people in order to rebuild his game. And rebuild he did. He gave the Canucks a solid 5 years of service before jettisoning to Calgary. But the Canucks were not worried, because they had his replacement waiting in the wings, Thatcher Demko, who under the tutelage of Ian Clark has become one of the best goaltenders in the league. What is the Canucks' state of goaltending at the moment? Well, they have an excellent coaching setup between Vancouver and Abbotsford. So good in fact that the Toronto Maple Leafs poached AHL goalie coach Curtis Sanford from the Canucks. In Vancouver, Ian Clark is a director of goaltending and has a say in which goaltenders to draft. In Abbotsford, Marko Torenius was brought in. This is the man who helped develop Igor Shesterkin in Russia. Under his guidance is the promising Arthur Silovs and intriguing Nikita Tolopilo. Best case scenario for the Canucks? Thatcher Demko has a long career as an elite starter. And in order to do this, he'll need a competent backup goalie. Right now, Casey DeSmith is doing a fine job, but with the Canucks system that they have in place, they should be able to develop these goalies in-house. Worst case scenario, Demko leaves in free agency. But this time, there won't be another goalie graveyard. In Ian Clark, we trust. If you guys enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe. Thank you.